how many people are in this room already? All right, got it. We know we're recording. Welcome so much. It's so amazing to see all of these friendly faces. Some of you I recognize, some of you are brand spanking new. Hello, so I'm Jess, if you missed my introduction at the beginning. So we're going to dive straight in. We're going to be talking today about all sorts of different topics, all to do with anthrozoology and the human-animal relationship. I know that we've just had the video explaining that lots of people here are early career anthrozoologists or early career scholars working with the human-animal relationship in some capacity. So if you want to keep any of your questions for this session anonymous, if you're a bit nervous about putting your camera on, then please use the chat box. We can read out questions. You can also use the little raise the hand function if you're happy to turn on your microphone or your camera and ask the questions yourselves. So this session is all about podcasts, but it's also about outreach. And as many of us are interested in advocating for animals through our research practice, many of us as aspiring or working anthrozoologists, we are concerned and we think very carefully about the impact that our research approach and our research dissemination, what that impact has for animals. And so I'd like to remind everyone of Linda Burke's question when she was thinking through this emerging field of anthrozoology. She asked, what's in it for the animal? And so the way that we present our research, the audiences that we try to engage with, the ways that we bring in the animal perspective, these are all different considerations we have when we're thinking about the greater impact of our research. And we also have additional pressures as academics. We're constantly told by university administrators that we need to be thinking about the impact of our research. So we have a funding pressure there as well. And so these are going to be some of the nitty-gritty topics that we'll get into in the discussions today. We have 3 podcasts joining us in this session. So we have The Animal Turn by Claudia Hertenfelder. Can you give me a wave, Claudia? Lovely. We have The Deal with Animals by Marika Bell. So give me a wave, Marika. There she is. And then we have a slightly more complicated one because we have multiple hosts. We have the Anthrozoology podcast with Chris Hill, one of our event organizers today, Sarah Oxley-Heaney, another AIP organizer, and Michelle Sidalski, who just gave us the nice introductory pep talk at the beginning of the conference. So I'm not going to talk for too long. I'm going to pass you over to each of the podcasts now. So podcast hosts, I'm going to ask that you introduce yourself and your podcast. Specifically, try and think of this as an opportunity to give your lift speech. So not everyone here is going to know of your podcast. I'm sure actually most people do, but for the sake of the recording, if you could explain how you came to podcasting, what it was that inspired your podcast, and what your podcast sets out to achieve, and also where they can find it. So let's start with Claudia.
That's not a good way to start a recording, clearing your throat. Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Hertenfelder, and I'm the founder and host of the Animal Turn podcast. I started the Animal Turn podcast in 2020 when I was a PhD candidate, and I was relatively new to the realm of animal studies myself. And I realized that I was learning a whole bunch. Animal studies is interdisciplinary, and it's really easy to start to feel quite overwhelmed by how much there is. But there's also a lot of really exciting conceptual developments in the field. So what I did was I was like, well, while I'm learning about it, why don't I record it so that folks can join me on the journey? So the Animal Turn podcast is set around seasons. Every season is focused on a specific theme. And then in every episode of that theme, I interview a specific guest about a concept related to that theme. So as way of an example, season 1 looked at animals in the law, and every episode of that season spoke to a scholar about a concept related to animals and law. The 10th episode of every season is dedicated to what I call a grad review, where myself and some graduate students speak to one another and we kind of review the season. What was difficult, what was easy, what concepts really worked together, and where did they rub up against one another? We're now entering our 6th season. It's coming up soon. And it's been really, really delightful. I'm over 60 episodes in now, 26,000 downloads. The podcast won the Australasian Animal Studies Association Award for Popular Communication, and it's exceeded all of my expectations. It's truly something that I'm dedicated to, and I will contribute and continue to build over the next decade, hopefully. So that's my motivation, and the way in which I think it helps animals is that by getting scholars to think more complexly about these concepts, I think we can engage with animals in more complex ways, in ways that resist the simple story. So that's my elevator/lift pitch.
Thank you. And thank you for explaining that lift is elevator. Forget. Okay, Marika.
Unmute here. Okay, so I'm Marika Bell. I'm the host and creator of the Deal with Animals podcast, and it is a podcast about the connection and interaction between humans and other animals. But I like to take a look at it in the way that it is multidisciplinary. There are so many different areas that we could be looking into. And as Claudia was saying, it can be overwhelming, especially for anybody who has never even heard of anthrozoology, which there are a lot of people in the general public that haven't heard of it. So I'm really taking the tack of trying to introduce the idea to the general public while also making it a really useful podcast for anybody who is interested in anthrozoology in academia, but also making it accessible for your armchair academics, so to speak. So we I do like to talk to researchers and academics and scholars, but I also really like to bring in the lived experiences of people who work with animals in public spaces, in their professions, even in just their enthusiasms. What is it that they connect to animals with? So examples of this are, I've talked to a woman who calls herself the Humane Gardener, and she's written a book about that. And it helps people interact with the animals in their own backyards. And that was a really popular episode for people who just like to garden, right? They're not necessarily scholars. And I talked to someone who actually is a past student in the same Exeter group that we have all been in here. Well, many of us, I imagine, on her work with birds and falconry. So her spiritual connection with that. So there's a lot of different areas in which, the humans and animals interact. And I want people to understand that our connection with animals is so broad. It's much broader than most people ever think about. When many people think about human-animal interaction, they think about their pets, and they don't necessarily think about, exploring the Hindu connection with dairy, so it allows people who aren't necessarily having access to expensive research journals to get in there and really explore some of the more scholarly areas of anthrozoology, but also for the scholars to really see the lived experiences and understand where your average person is coming from when they're interacting with animals. And I really also think it's important that we make our research more accessible to the public while sharing the voices and those lived experiences of our human connection with animals.
Really, really nice summary there. It is such a huge interdisciplinary field. And it's interesting how already you both the podcasts touch on different themes and talk to different academics, scholars, and also people working in kind of surrounding different fields. Okay, so Sarah, you've got your microphone on, so I'm guessing you're speaking on behalf of the Anthrozoology podcast. Is that correct? Lovely.
Okay, so our podcast, the Anthrozoology podcast, aims to cover all things related to anthrozoology. and we explore human-animal relations from a non-anthropocentric perspective. So as mentioned before, I'm Sarah, and I'm exploring shark-human relationships. And I'm joined by my co-hosts, Michelle, who studies the ethics of aiding elephants in Nepal, and Chris, who studies the attitudes and perspectives towards roaming cats and cat-human relations. With our podcast, we intend to bring our audience, with our podcast, we tend to bring to our audience engaging conversations, insights, and discoveries from the world of anthrozoology. We're all passionate about our projects and keen to make academic studies more accessible and promote our ethos of treating all animals with the dignity and respect that they deserve, especially our research subjects. For us, anthrozoology isn't just a field of study, it's a lens through which we view the intricate connections between humans and animals. Our mission is to introduce our audience to this captivating discipline, spark meaningful discussions, and most importantly, give a voice to the often overlooked perspective of the other than human animal kingdom. Our podcast is a platform for both early career anthrozoologists to share their groundbreaking research, and we also invite established experts to delve into their work and insights. With a casual and informal style, we explore topics ranging from what does it mean to be labelled feral, discussing memorial animal tattoos, to discussing force-free dog training and beyond. We aim to challenge the prevailing human exceptionalism of our societies and work towards improving the lives of non-human animals. Join us while we redefine our relationship with the animal kingdom and make the world a better place for all species. Bridging the gap between academia and the everyday, together we'll explore how we can create change and improve the lives of all living beings, human and non-human alike. Our target audience ranges from seasoned anthrozoologists to those who are simply curious about the world of human-animal relations. On the Anthrozoology podcast, we attempt to give other than human animals a voice and explore the incredible web of life that connects us all. Our goal is to publish one episode a month, which we have mostly succeeded in doing since we began recording around 3 years ago. Our latest episode 25, Cat Abandonment in Saudi Arabia, which happens to be mine, has just been released. When we began, none of us had any prior experience of podcasting, and we've been learning as we go along. All 3 of the co-founders are here today, and we're happy to engage in the panel discussion. You can find a link to our webpage and podcast platforms in the abstract book. If you want to present your research or have a casual chat about your research on our show, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the chat box. You might have a question about podcasting in general. You might have a question about individual episodes even. If you have a specific question for a specific podcast host, that's great. If you have questions more generally, we can put it to everyone, so that's great too. You can also use the little hand function to let me know that you would like to ask your question either with the camera on or off, but using your microphone. So to get the ball rolling, I would like to talk a little bit about podcasting as a medium, because it seems to me that podcasting has become really, really popular, and I don't remember it being this popular, say, even 5 years ago. So I was wondering if, and this is a question to everyone quite broadly, what was it that brought you to podcasting specifically, and what makes it your medium of choice? Don't know if anyone wants to start.
I don't mind jumping in. So I actually did a journalism degree journalism degree as my undergrad. So I'm a classic interdisciplinary person where every single degree is different from the one before. So I was always interested in radio, and then I found myself getting interested in political science and just did a sharp turn left and turned away from radio. And podcasting just seemed like an organic kind of development when I was doing this exploration. But I do think you're right. I do think that podcasting has had something of an explosion in the last 7 years. And one of the reasons I think this is, well, one, I think that people are enjoying long form conversations. I think people are getting really tired of these short sound bites. You want to get in depth and in detail with an idea. And all of a sudden, you're on the news and you're hearing an expert speak for 3 seconds. Like, that's not going to get into the depth of a problem. It's not going to show you the intricacies of an issue, really. So I think people really want to have kind of in-depth engagement with subject matter. And I think that they're frustrated by the lack of that. And two, I think the indie podcasting scene facilitates a lot of trust. Big corporations are producing a lot of information and a lot of content. But when you have people that are really passionate, like folks in this room here, who are really passionate about animal studies and are willing to learn through the medium, like you can hear, I think all of us have started this podcast. All of us are relatively new to podcasting, and kind of we've all shown as we've podcasted how we've learned about podcasting and animal studies on the process. So yeah, I think that for me is my kind of quick take on why I think podcasting has really exploded.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because I think one of the other things that kind of came to mind was, because Sarah, you mentioned that, your podcast is quite new and fresh, and you guys didn't have that experience of podcasting before. Now, Claudia, you're saying that you had this degree background in journalism. So it seems like podcasting is really accessible as a medium to explore, regardless of your background, because it seems to be quite flexible as a medium, which is great to hear. Marika, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would. And I see there's a question as well in the chat, which I'm happy to jump in on also. I think a lot of the sudden boom in podcasting also comes from the fact that the pandemic happened. I know that's one of the reasons I started podcasting, was that, people were stuck at home, and it's like, okay, now I've been at home for a year, and this was my story, and my brain was turning to mush, and I needed a creative outlet, a way to learn some things and talk with people who, knew more than I did about subjects that I was interested in. So it was, for me, a really initially selfish sort of beginning, where I was just like, you know what, I want to talk to people. How could I do this? I really loved, learning when I was in Exeter, and the way that Anthrozoology in particular really opened up my line of thoughts into areas about our connection with animals that I hadn't ever really thought of before, as much as I considered myself an animal person in the past. So when I thought about that, I thought, well, how can I learn from people who are already doing that work while I'm stuck at home? So I think a lot of people started podcasting around that same time, and some of those podcasts, just lasted for the pandemic, or lasted for that first couple of years that people played around with it. But others just kept going, because it really is a lot of fun, and you get into the different parts of it. Again, as you talked before, it is very accessible. Just about anybody can podcast with what you've got in your home right now on your regular computer system. You don't need to buy any special equipment particularly. You don't even need to really spend any money if there's plenty of free options for platforms to use. So you can start and just see if you like it. You can do short form podcasts and just plan to do, 3 episodes about a subject a lot about, or, just invite a few people that you already know, which I'll get into this question now, which was how do you invite guests onto your podcast, and what kind of challenges you face when you're doing that. And the way I started with that was I invited people I knew. So I reached out to my own network in Anthrozoology, in different areas where people connect with animals. For me, that was quite a lot of dog training areas, but also people who work with dogs in other areas. Like my first series was on health and wellness. And so, COVID was an issue. I just did some research and found somebody who was an expert in COVID, even though I didn't really know them, an expert on how COVID affects animals, or potentially affects animals, and whether we should be worrying about it with our pets, because it was back when we were thinking about that. So you can do a lot of different things with podcasting, but I think leaning into what you're already comfortable with is a really good way to start, so that you can really get some flow going, and reaching out to your network. Because you already know interesting people. So you're going to have interesting conversations with people about subjects that you're excited about. It's going to be an interesting podcast if you're showing your enthusiasm for the subject too.
So maybe that speaks a little bit to the flexibility of podcasting as a medium, in that it is creative as well as it being academic in this case. And so you're kind of learning from your guests, and then your guests might mention other authors or other academics, and then you can reach out to them. And so it seems from what you're explaining that it seems to be quite an organic medium to be dealing with. Sarah, you'd like to have
it certainly has been for me. Yeah, it was, you know, I would love to do like a comedy podcast, but I'm not a very funny person. So, you know, while I will listen to comedy podcasts, I really have to lean into what I'm actually good at, which is talking with people. I really enjoy talking with people, it turns out. So that's what worked for me and for my podcast. The other really quick part of that question was, for anyone who wants to answer, I'm a theologian. How much do you cover religion and theology in your podcasts? I find it actually comes up pretty regularly, at least spiritual connections with animals comes up very regularly. And because of that, I actually did a series on animals and the divine, and got to talk to, I mean, again, not my area of research. I didn't really have any background in animals and spirituality, but I got to talk to some really cool people who did and who were doing research on it, but also people who work with animals within their religions. And so it was a really interesting series. And yeah, and if you're interested in that sort of thing, that one was fun.
We'll definitely, we can put the link to that in the chat as well. Sarah, you had your hand raised. You're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add that the reason our podcast came about was us having discussions about specific subjects within Anthrozoology, and then one day one of us said, you know, we should have a podcast, record these discussions, and it became a good idea because when we were first studying, or at least when I was first studying, I wanted to learn more about anthrozoological topics, and quickly found out there are hardly any podcasts, very few YouTube channels, anything that really covers anthrozoology. And so it became almost that there was a niche, a gap there, a niche that we could fit into quite quickly. And one of the great aspects with social media having such an explosion, yeah, we did, Debbie, having such an explosion is that it basically took the elitist pressure of having a polished, perfect program that you could put out there. I mean, there's so much on social media now, so many different channels, which not with just with podcasting, with all sorts of stuff where people have millions of viewers, and before social media, they wouldn't be able to, probably wouldn't get past a producer or a director in terms of, you know, that having the quality or an idea, even the idea wouldn't pass what a producer or a director might like. So it actually means that you're not putting your head above the parapet in many ways. You're just part of the mass, and therefore you don't feel so pressured when you put one out there. You're just having a conversation. And one of the things we try to do as well is, as I'm sure the other podcasters, is to use terminology that doesn't confuse people and doesn't make people feel alienated. And that's one of the really nice things about having a chat as well. In terms of how we invite people, we are always open to people inviting themselves, having a discussion with us. And if anybody here today wants to come on one of our podcasts, please message any of Chris, myself, or Michelle. But we also reach out to certain people that we think we come across that we think have got interesting research. So we don't have a set way of finding people. We try to be quite organic and rhizomatic in the way that we find people to join us. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Claudia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in terms of the flexibility of podcasting, there's one thing to be a kind of podcast host who's doing interviews, but there are many, many types of ways to do podcasts, right? There are scripted podcasts, there are story podcasts. There's loads of interesting ways that animal stories have not yet been told. So anyone who's listening today, there are loads of opportunities to do that. But also, even if you don't want to start a podcast, exploring recording as an avenue for exploring your own research is quite exciting. So if you're busy undertaking a master's degree or a PhD degree, I know increasingly universities are looking for creative ways ways to output your own research. So if you are also writing a paper, or you've just finished writing a paper, a really good idea is to send a message to a podcast, actually, and say, hey, I've just written this paper, or hey, I've just written this book, or we've got an upcoming conference. Sometimes, not always, they will say yes, and it's really worth it. But you can also create your own content. So if you're nearing the end of your PhD project, for example, you can consider, like Marika said, doing a short form, and you can release that on YouTube at no cost. You can, there are loads of platforms where you can release it, and universities have some grants and funds to support people that are doing this type of work. So I just wanted to point out that, yes, you've got these kind of like formalized podcasts that have been around now for a good couple of years, but you can use the audio platform yourself as a student and as a scholar.
Brilliant. That's a really good point. And something that I wanted to pick your brains with, actually, Claudia, was for people that, particularly emerging scholars who may not be confident enough yet to speak with confidence, even about their own research, or people that may not want to speak publicly, first person, but they might be interested in podcasting as a medium, as a way of meeting and networking with other academics, other researchers. And I know that you're growing your podcast at the moment, so what other opportunities are there out there within the medium of podcasting and media more generally, for people that are interested in maybe dipping their toes but don't want to be the host of their own podcast, or they don't want to be interviewed on a podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think several of us are kind of expanding. I know Marika has on her website also opportunities if you sign up to her newsletters to learn more about podcasting. I know Josh Milburn, who's the host of the Knowing Animals podcast, is also kind of exploring opportunities in future. And I myself have just recently taken on 5 fellows who are students who are interested in kind of this intersection between communication, podcasting, and animal studies. So, I mean, that is an opportunity that I will keep running and fostering. But even outside of podcasting, I think there are tons of opportunities to learn to speak about your work. And it's going to seem a bit left field, but I really think if you've got an improv class near you, improv is probably one of the most useful things that you'll ever undertake, because it teaches you to kind of speak, and I'm going to use the wrong phrase, it's off the fly of your pants. No, that's not right. I always get metaphors wrong. Off the seat of your pants. That's it. Okay. So I think doing things like improv and practicing public speaking and taking opportunities to speak in front of your classes is really good. But also signing up to some podcasting newsletters. There are loads and loads. You pointed out at the beginning how much podcasting has exploded, and it really, 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 really has exploded. Even outside of our niche podcasts, maybe you're interested in crime. You can become an intern on a crime podcast and learn more about crime that way, and then intersect crime and animals in your own research. So you just have to be a bit kind of industrious, I think, in looking for these.
I mean, industrious is a great word as well, as is entrepreneurial. And it's amazing just how quickly one idea can take hold, and suddenly you're networking with lots of different people, and those opportunities start to become more available. Chris?
I'm just raising my hand for Michelle because apparently the function doesn't work.
Yes, I'm unable to raise my hand. I'm sorry. I actually just wanted to sort of take what you both were saying and sort of flip it on its head, because we've also found that the podcasting and bringing in sort of random people has also helped us in the creation of knowledge and the co-creation of knowledge, and coming up with, we may have a topic, and in that podcasting process, we realize, oh, we've missed some major elements and we really need to start working on this as a research project. So we can then incorporate, people into academic papers or into other creative pursuits that we would not have thought of if we were just sitting around having a conversation in a room. And then I did just want to address the religion question too, just circle back around to that for a moment, just because we actually had a conversation with someone about reincarnation on our podcast, and we received a lot of contacts asking, why, first of all, and then also asking, was it appropriate on a scientific podcast? Was it this? Was it that? And a lot of encouragement as well from other people. And we tried to tell people that we're open to discussing anything that's important to people, right, or that impacts their relationships. And so, like Marika said, it does come up a lot, and we try to be open to to everything and willing to discuss anything that's of interest to our listeners and our guests.
Brilliant, thank you. Marika?
Yeah, I also wanted to talk a little bit about people starting podcasts and really encourage anyone, if they're thinking about doing that, to really just reach out to one of us, any of us, about it, because it is such an accessible way for people to share their research. And we already said that, but I just wanted to underline the importance of your own voice and getting research out there to the public that they would not otherwise be able to see ever, other than through, maybe if they're lucky, the lens of traditional media, which often, hyperbolizes or oversimplifies your research. If anybody's ever had their research covered by the traditional media, they will have probably had this experience where, red wine can cure cancer, which would be lovely to believe, but doesn't actually, it turns out, if you read the research. Or broccoli can cause cancer, which also isn't actually true, but is something I heard on the news in an actual headline in regular evening news. So it just really is so important to get information out there and for people to hear it coming from people who know what they're talking about, right? So the scholars who are actually doing the research, you can get it out in your own words and not have it filtered through the media filter, I think is such an important aspect of what podcasting brings us. And because there is so much misinformation out there right now, especially about animals and about our connection with animals, it's even more important that there are voices out there that people can get to, that are putting out accurate information and current research, and that's something that is really easy to do now. And so yeah, I just really encourage everyone, if they're even remotely interested, to definitely reach out and find out about it, because it's not as hard as it looks. And I know that there's also sometimes an issue with the who really wants to listen to me, who really cares about me. And it doesn't really matter. If it's something that you're excited about and you want to share, then this is a really great way of doing it. And who cares if it's only your family that listens, or only 12 people that listens, that's still 12 people who wouldn't have known about that. And that's cool. So get out there and share your research for sure.
Yeah, that is cool. Claudia?
I did want to also say that it's easy to do, but it's also a lot of work. I think it's sometimes on the face of it, all you hear is the kind of finished product. And I think anyone who's made a video or made any sort of content is aware of this. It's fun and we're excited about it, but it does take a lot of work. And I think the more you learn, the more you pay attention to things like the quality of your sound, and the more deep into it you get, the more time you find spending on this. So there is a fair bit of work that goes into, you have to have a platform where you record, you then edit it, and editing is generally the place that takes some of the most time. And as you're learning, you're spending more time doing this. So I think it's also, it's also something that requires a fair bit of dedication and time. And I'm sure everyone on the panel can attest to the fact that as much as it's really accessible, it is also a medium that requires dedication and commitment and time. And it's oftentimes something we're not getting paid for. It's not a big money-making pursuit. It really is something that's done for the love of the subject and for centering, at least for me, and I think for everyone here, for centering animals and making sure that animals are on the agenda.
Yeah, some really, really important points there. So I want to talk a little bit now about the process. So let's say we've just persuaded several people in this audience to reach out to one or more of you and offer up their research as the next episode. What could you tell them to kind of could you walk them through the process? How does that interview work for someone that's never been on a podcast before as a guest? What makes a good guest for a start? And what would they expect? Do you meet them beforehand? Do they get the questions beforehand? Michelle, your hand shot up.
I'm using a real hand. How strange. Well, I can tell you how we, do our process. And to answer the last question first, who makes a good guest? Almost anyone, of any age in any field, whether they're, an academic in the field or whether they're just somebody who has an interesting perspective on things or an interesting career. So when we find someone who reaches out about a paper, or we read a paper that we're interested in, we ask that they come on and prepare just a very brief introduction to the paper, like for a layperson. How would you explain your paper? Again, your elevator pitch. And then we reassure them that we are a very comfortable podcast, and we like our guests to feel comfortable and allow the conversation to grow organically, as opposed to having like some very specific questions we can provide for them beforehand. Just try to see it as a very supportive and encouraging environment. And we reassure them that there won't be, attacks. There won't be any, in their face questioning their abilities or anything. So I think that's really important, so people know that they're safe. It's a safe place.
Brilliant. And let's go to Marika. Marika, does your process differ at all?
It can differ. And I don't know, maybe Claudia's had a similar experience too, where initially I was looking for people. I've recently realized that it's when I'm actually looking for a guest, what I'm looking for specifically is a really different perspective on maybe a story people have heard before. So it's some aspect of it that is surprising that I really like. I want people to start thinking about that. I also like to hear interesting stories. So narratives from people's experiences that, again, could be surprising, could be interesting to other people. And I know that if I'm going to find it interesting, if I find it surprising, then probably my listeners will also. So that's primarily what I'm looking for, is something that's a little bit out of the box when it comes to some new information or some new perspective that people hear. And luckily there is a lot of that, because the Deal with Animals is a fairly global podcast. I try to get guests from all over the world, and I've reached out to people and I've had people reach out to me. But I would love for even more people to reach out. I think the most people I get reaching out are, oddly at this point, literary agents, which I find really interesting, because my podcast also, I'm kind of a book nerd. So I love to share books. And one of the things I like to do is ask my guests about what books they read. And I've been getting more and more agents reach out to me to try to promote their authors' books on the podcast. And that's been an interesting development over really the last year or so, is getting quite a few of those requests. And they always have a really nicely prepared sheet on, what they would want to talk about and what the person is an expert in and whether that would fit in with the podcast. So I can kind of get an idea if it would be a good fit or not. I think the hardest thing I have, though, is telling people no. When there is somebody that comes and I'm like, oh, well, this is, let's say, a dog walker, and they want to tell me about their dog walking business. That's, to me, not going to be as interesting of a story, but maybe they do have a really cool perspective on it. But if they don't share that with me off the bat, and they just tell me that they're a dog walker and they want to talk about dog walking, I might not, say yes. Because I don't, it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of time sifting through that sort of thing. So make your pitch, even if it's a short pitch, which is fine, just something surprising and interesting.
Brilliant, thank you. And Claudia, what about your process?
So because I follow a season format, I tend to think across the 10 episodes. So I know that the 10th episode is a grad review. So I do have bonus content, and often that bonus content is speaking to people about books, etc. Because like Marika, I've had publication houses contacting me increasingly. Or Jess, when you were on the show, we highlighted a conference. So if there's a particular event or a particular book that we could highlight, I do that. But I do bonus episodes kind of between seasons. My seasons focus on an arc. They have an arc, right? So I did, for example, the season on animals and biosecurity. And biosecurity, like many concepts, it seems really obvious, but the closer you look at it, you're like, what the hell is that? So I start out every season with that concept. What is biosecurity? And then that really kind of sets the scene for getting into these different concepts. And I try to identify people that have, sometimes they're really quite like they're a canon person in thinking about and talking about an issue, and other times they provide a unique and interesting perspective related to that topic. So like in that same season, I spoke to Gladys Kalema Zukusoka from, she was Uganda's first wildlife vet. Amazing story. She's worked directly with gorillas. She speaks about how conservation and public health are interconnected with one another, and it was just an unbelievable conversation. And she provided a really nice way to end off the season on biosecurity, because she was doing something quite active in the realm of biosecurity as a practitioner. In terms of being a good guest, now, I think that's actually a really good question. Yes, everybody is interesting and everybody has a wonderful story. And I think as people have interviewed people, we know that. As scholars who have done research with people, we know you sit down with someone and you put in your listening ears, you find out that they are interesting. But to be a good guest, I think listen to the questions and be forthcoming with your answers. So if someone asks you a question, don't just say yes, or don't just say no, because as a podcaster, that's really hard. So I don't know if you've ever listened to a podcast and like this great question set up and someone says, yes, I've thought about that. And then you sit there, you're like, well, so can you extrapolate or tell me more? And that's totally fine. That's how conversations happen. But if you want to be, don't be afraid to take up space. You are the guest, you are the star, you are the one that gets to take up space, and not us as the interviewers. So to be a good guest, go onto the show being willing to take up space. That would be yep, that's it. I'm done.
Excellent advice. That is excellent advice. Okay, so my next question for you then is, if you could, and I'm going to give you a moment to think about this, if you could promote just one episode that you have recorded that's out there in the world, not something coming soon, not something you're planning, but something that our audience could go and listen to now, but they're not going to because maybe in the half-hour break, but you know, this is your moment to pick your favorite, a really memorable one. Yeah, what would it be? The look of horror on Claudia's face. Go ahead, Michelle.
I think I like all of them, but I think one of the most interesting ones that we did was when we had the poet Gordon Mead on, because in the process of having that conversation, I mean, the poetry and the photographs, the Joanne McCullough photographs are so amazing, but in the process of that conversation, he came to the realization that he is no longer an animal welfare person. He's actually an animal advocate, an animal rights advocate. You know, he really came to some realizations, I think, about himself that were very moving. So I think that's why that one stands out to me.
Really nice.
This is so like agonizing, Jess.
Sorry.
Blimey. Okay, I can tell you the most downloaded episode is the episode with Will Kimlicka, which was my very first episode ever. And the sound is particularly bad on that episode. But yet it's the most downloaded by far. And I think that's because Will Kimlicka is just really an impressive philosopher and person and human, and he's just a really nice human being. So it's always a delight to talk to him. But I would probably say one of my favorite episodes ever was with Martin Ulrich speaking about animal music. And that was in a season focused on animals and sound. And he just knew absolutely everything there was about animals and music, whether it was thinking about how animals' bodies are used in the making of musical instruments, to how animals themselves kind of craft and create music and develop their own kind of musical cultures. And he was just so like giving of his time and ideas. So I would say that that's probably one of my favorites. And also Yamini Narayanan and Kritika Surasan and Jasupa, but there are very, very many.
Brilliant. Okay, Marika.
Yeah, that's really hard. I mean, there are some that I wish everyone would listen to. Like we did an episode on compassion fatigue, which I thought was such a really important topic. So sometimes it's the topic that I'm like, oh, this is such a great topic, and I hope everybody listens to this one because it's so good. But then there's other ones that like I just really enjoyed talking to the person, themselves. So that's always kind of fun when you're like, oh, this was such a great guest. Like, and the topic was good too, but great. Just, you really enjoyed the conversation. And that's really fun for me. And then sometimes there's the ones that are just like, my favorite ones are the ones where I'm talking about something completely left field. Like, I really enjoyed one of the specials where we talked about furry fandom. And that was just fun. We did it for a Valentine's Day special. And it was just, and it was an early researcher. And, it's not like she's somebody who is famous. Some of the other specials that we've had were like, Hal Herzog and Clive Wynne and, people that people know their names. And nobody knew Victoria's name, but her topic was just so fascinating. And who doesn't have questions about something that we, in popular culture has become such a phenomenon. So yeah, I think that there's just so many different areas, and I don't know if I could pick just one because there's just so many different parts, right? Like, there's some that I like for different reasons. So I would name those three just because those were ones that I really enjoyed doing, but or ways in which I enjoy doing it. And again, just says why it's such a great and fun thing to do, podcasting, because you do get surprised. So I think the surprising episode, something where I learned something really new and interesting, especially when I didn't necessarily expect to, is my favorite.
But I mean, this also, that every single one of you have just mentioned topics that are wildly different to each other. So I think it also speaks a lot to the topics and the content that can be included in podcasts that speak to the human-animal relationship, and that you're always going to find something that you're interested in if you're interested in animals. So we do have a question in the chat from Ellen, which is, to those that have season themes, how do you pick those themes? I don't know, maybe Claudia?
Sure. So yeah, it's quite organic, actually. I have way more ideas and themes and that I would like to unpack and do, but because it's 10 per, and I normally release one per week, that's 10 weeks, etc., etc. But in general, it's kind of, sometimes they're inspired by the season that came before, but oftentimes they're inspired by many of my own research interests and the folks that are around me and what they're working on. So Animals and the Law was because the podcast is sponsored by Animals and Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, a really great research group that if you've got the time to go and check out their stuff, also called Apple, not Apple, but Apple. And one of their focuses is on law. So that seemed like a natural beginning place. But the second season, which looked at animals and experience, was for me really interesting because my own research focuses on questions of phenomenology. How do animals experience the world? A key thing of this podcast is I'm trying to position animals front and center. So you've mentioned a couple of times here, like the human-animal relation. That's an aspect of what I do on the podcast. Oftentimes, I'm actually trying to understand the animal experience, which is sometimes not necessarily putting humans' connections with those animals front and center. Animals and sound, again, to researchers that worked with me at Queen's University, we're working on sound, and I approached them and I said, hey, do you want to sponsor a season on animals and sound? And they were totally down and interested in it. Same thing with Animals and Urban and the upcoming season on animals and politics. So it's a kind of a mixture of opportunistic ideas as well as inspiration from previous episodes and some of my own kind of research interests and politics.
Brilliant, thank you. And Marika, you said you had a season on Animals and the Divine. How did that come about?
Yeah, so how did that one come about? It came about, oddly enough, because I was researching some other topic, and somebody I found and consequently recorded an episode with, her topic was research that she'd done on animals used in kosher slaughter practices. And that got me thinking about all the ways in which animals are used and thought about in religions. And funnily enough, the animals and religion course at the University of Exeter was not one I got a chance to take. And I always sort of regretted that. It seemed like a really interesting series and topic. And I don't know if that's still offered. I hope it is. But I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to learn about the subject I didn't really get to learn about. And when I recorded that particular episode with her, even though I recorded it maybe a year before all of the others, I knew that it was going to be a really cool series, because even that one conversation with her was just so fascinating. You know, I have no idea about how animals are used in the Jewish traditional Jewish religion, and I just learned so much. It was really, really interesting, and I knew that if I, you know, could find different people wanting to either having explored their religions from their spiritual perspective or from their academic endeavors, then it would be a really fascinating series, and I really think that it was. It's just funny, because when I was starting to think about podcasting, how I would set it up, we were talking a little bit here in the chat about how you find podcasts, because I was like, okay, I've never listened to a podcast before, and I really literally had not ever listened to a podcast before I started podcasting. I should look for podcasts, and of course I looked in general for podcasts I would find interesting, which would be ones related to animals, and looking up Anthrozoology, and I found the Anthrozoology podcast, and I found Ologies, which is one of my favorite podcasts now as well. And funnily enough, I think if I had found the Animal Turn, which I had not, I'm not even sure I would have started podcasting. I've been like, oh, well, this is an amazing podcast. I will just listen to this one, because it's already kind of doing what I like. But I actually didn't find the Animal Turn for like another 6 or 9 months, when somebody, I think it was maybe actually somebody from the Anthrozoology podcast, was like, oh, have you heard about the Animal Turn? I'm like, no. And then I found it and was like, oh, well, this is awesome, because this is exactly what I wanted to be doing. But that's cool, because we had different, you know, we have different sort of tracks we go down. But it's just really neat, because I like listening to Claudia's podcast, because she does explore that sort of academic side of what is going on in these sorts of areas. And I hope, Claudia, you do an animals and religion series as well, because I can't wait to see the people you get a chance to talk to. But yeah, I think when you're actually coming up with the series, again, for me, it was about who I already had connections with, also who had reached out to me, and then how many episodes I've gathered and been able to edit. If those ones are ready to go, then I like to just release that season or that series. I don't really do seasons, because I just kind of keep going. But sometimes I do try to like put them in a particular spot, and I use the specials for that. But like, coming up in January, I'm trying to do a whole series on vegan culture. And so I want to do that in January, because, you know, it's the start of a new year, and that's when people like to change their habits and that sort of thing. So I'm already putting together episodes for that one, even though it's a few months out. I'm hoping I can kind of get caught up on a lot of editing, and then take a little bit of an editing break come January, but we'll see.
Well, fingers crossed and good luck. So we have time for one more question, and I'd like to bring it back to centralizing the animal. So I'd like to bring back in Linda Burke's question of what's in it for the animal. What does your podcast, and what does podcasting in general do for animals?
I'll jump in. I think, like we said right at the beginning, I think podcasting positions the animals front and center. And I really do think that is significant in and of itself. In a world in which animals are spoken of as objects, and they're put to the sideline of conversations, they're not kind of taken seriously as beings that experience and encounter the world, and that those encounters are important, right? I think all of our podcasts view those encounters as not only important in and of themselves, but important enough to invest time and put them on the agenda. And I think that is how the animals, that is what it's doing for the animals. It is starting to be used, our material is starting to be used in classrooms. It's starting to be used as support material to help students better grapple with some of the details of academia, to grapple with some of the complexities of activism. And I think that anything that assists with doing that work is putting animals front and center. I know that several of the podcasts here also kind of play animal sounds. They position animal stories, not just at the species level, right? Not just like cows or eagles. You know, we bring in specific animals' stories. And I think that really is important. It's not done enough, and it's not done enough with the sensitivity that animals deserve. So I think that's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. Great answer. Sarah?
Yeah, to go back to a previous question you had about favorite podcasts. I mean, I don't think it's possible to tell you which one would be my favorite, because I'd like to go forward a few years and see which one had the most impact on changing animals' lives. So I don't think that knowing what any podcast does for animals is not knowable until you actually are able to find out their impact. And you've actually, as all conversations, given me an idea that maybe we can revisit our podcast guests in the future to say, how has your research actually helped to change animals' lives, people's lives. One example I can give myself, I was contacted yesterday by somebody who's interested in cat abandonment in Saudi Arabia. And just by leaving breadcrumb trails here and there, you don't have to be big, you don't have to be famous, you don't have to be huge, you don't have to be super confident, but just trying to make a change, just trying to hope that somebody will pick up something that you've said and resonate, I think is really important. And so at the moment, that would be my favorite podcast, because that's had an impact because somebody's come back and is going to try and hopefully use that. But in terms of how animals are helped, I think it's a super interesting question. It obviously does get animals on the agenda. Trying to get people to listen is a completely different thing as well. And trying to get your story or the animals' stories out there is very different. And I think it's just by pushing and trying and changing and writing and recording and making videos and going on social media, and somewhere at some time somebody might just have a change of mind about what they think about animals. Just like 30 years ago, a poster that somebody made about the way that milk was generated in the UK completely changed my view and therefore the lives of animals through that poster. So thank you.
Brilliant, very encouraging. Chris, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of answering both questions. But yeah, sort of what's in it for the animals. From my perspective, I'd like to think that it's inspiring future anthrozoologists. So I'm thinking of maybe current students now who are thinking of doing research degrees to sort of actually see a less anthropocentric way of sort of studying and including animals in their research. Because I think it's just exposing people that you don't have to sort of go in with that anthropocentric objectification, and just sort of, and being sort of early career too, and sort of seeing, oh, you can do a PhD doing that, you can be academic, this is legitimate, you don't have to buy into the sort of the anthropocentric objectification, and just sort of showing that that's long story short, to hopefully inspire future researchers to consider animals as sentient beings that they are.
America.
Yeah. So when I have people on, and what I hope that listeners get from the podcast and from all of the episodes is just a way to think about animals differently. So, I don't necessarily want them or need them to change their minds during the episode. I don't necessarily expect an episode to change someone's mind, but if the episode helps them think a little bit more in a different way about animals, that's what I would like. I would like them to start saying, oh, well, that's not how I've seen animals before. I didn't know that I had that interaction with animals in, the clothes that I'm wearing, or, what's going on in another country. I didn't even know about that. And so they start thinking more about their interactions with animals and animals in general as individuals, and what animals are for, quotes around that, and maybe decide to change their expectations or their preconceived ideas about what animals are. And that's what I want. I just want people to start to think more, because I think as soon as they start thinking more, they will come to conclusions maybe that they didn't expect.
Brilliant. And Claudia?
Yeah, just a very quick point. I put it in the chat as well. In terms of getting animals on the agenda, in terms of doing these things, you don't have to necessarily be the person who's doing the podcast. But if you like one of the shows, really helping us to get on the agenda and in the ears of people who maybe are not thinking about animals in the ways we're talking about at this conference or in this panel, leaving reviews really makes a big, big, big difference. And I know it's one of those things that you hear at the end of a podcast, please leave a review, click and subscribe. Like, we're all tired of being called to action all the time. I get it. But there is a way that you can help us to get animals more onto the agenda, and that is by leaving reviews. On Apple is one of the key places, Podchaser, Good Pods. These are all really, really, really helpful in terms of getting other people who are not in our space to find animals and to have these types of interventions in terms of finding community, like Chris said, or thinking about animals in new ways, like Marika's pointed out here. So yeah, I just wanted to flag that.
Brilliant. I think, because we are running over slightly, but I think that is a perfect place to end the first workshop of the first session of this year's AIP conference. So we are going to take a short break now. I want to say a huge, huge, huge thank you to our wonderful podcast hosts for joining us today, talking about all things podcasting, all things creative practice, and getting our research out there and putting animals center stage in all that we do.